It started out like any other uneventful Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, while David's phone buzzed on the counter next to me. He'd gone to the garage to look for some tool he needed for his latest home project. Normally, I wouldn't give his phone a second thought, but the sound grabbed my attention, almost like it was calling to me. I told myself I was just curious. It could have been a work notification or some random spam. But as I glanced over, I noticed the preview of the message on the screen. It was from someone saved as just S. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again, baby. I froze. My hand hovered above the countertop, trembling slightly. For a moment, my brain scrambled to justify it. Maybe it was a weird autocorrect mistake. Maybe it wasn't even his phone, though the familiar cracked screen and plain black case confirmed otherwise. A part of me wanted to dismiss it, to put it out of my mind and pretend I'd never seen it. But something about the message dug into me, like a sliver I couldn't ignore. David wasn't the kind of guy who'd let his phone buzz without checking it instantly. And he wasn't the type to have random, flirty messages from someone else, was he? 20 years of marriage, 2 kids, and countless shared memories had built a foundation I thought was unshakable. But in that moment, a tiny seed of doubt sprouted. He'd never changed his passcode, and my hands moved almost on autopilot as I unlocked his phone. The guilt of invading his privacy gnawed at me even as I tapped through his messages. But the guilt evaporated the moment I saw the truth. Her name was Sophie. I stopped breathing as I scrolled. The messages between them painted a picture I never wanted to see. They weren't just flirty. They were graphic, explicit, and unapologetically intimate. Sophie was gushing about how much she missed him, while David was making plans to see her again, complete with sickeningly specific details about what they'd do. Photos. There were photos. Some from her, some from him. A series of images I couldn't unsee, each more damning than the last. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. And then I saw her profile picture. Sophie, grinning at the camera with her bright, youthful face. Sophie, my son Liam's girlfriend. I staggered back, clutching the phone like it had burned me. Memories of the past year flooded my mind. Sophie had been at our family dinners, sitting at our table, laughing at David's dumb dad jokes. I had welcomed her into our home, treating her like one of my own. I'd praised her for making Liam so happy, told her she was part of the family now. And all this time, David had been what? Grooming her? Pursuing her behind my back? I struggled to breathe as my thoughts spiraled. Sophie had just turned 18 last month, but the messages didn't suggest something new. The way they talked to each other, the ease in their banter. It reeked of something longer, something calculated. My mind darted back to a dozen small moments I'd brushed off as unimportant. David offering to help her with her college applications. David staying up late in the living room, saying he was working, but now I realized texting her. Sophie blushing whenever he complimented her outfit. I wanted to scream. How could I have been so blind? When David came back into the kitchen, I shoved his phone into my pocket and forced a neutral expression. He looked at me with his usual, carefree smile, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Find the screwdriver? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Yup. Gonna fix that loose hinge on the cupboard, he replied cheerfully, like he hadn't just obliterated my trust and my family. I nodded, swallowing hard. There was no way I could confront him yet, not without thinking this through. My kids were upstairs, and I didn't want them to hear the nuclear explosion that was bound to happen when I confronted him. For the rest of the day, I operated on autopilot. I didn't even cry. I was too numb. When David wasn't looking, I scoured his phone for more evidence, taking screenshots and forwarding them to my email. The messages went back months, back to when Sophie was still 17. I found receipts for gifts he'd bought her, a reservation for a hotel in her college town, and countless photos of them together. By the time I lay in bed that night, pretending to be asleep next to him, I felt like a stranger in my own life. This was the man I'd shared 2 decades with, the father of my children, the person I'd thought I'd grow old with. But that man was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And what terrified me most was that this wasn't just an affair. This was predatory. As I stared at the ceiling that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him destroy our family. I didn't know how I'd confront him yet, but I would. And when I did, he'd have no way to wiggle out of it. The phone buzzed again on his nightstand, and I clenched my fists under the covers. Whatever Sophie was sending him could wait. Because soon, David would have to answer to me. The hours after discovering the messages felt like I was living in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed, replaying everything in my mind. Confronting David immediately felt impossible. I wasn't ready for the tidal wave of denial or manipulation I knew would come. I needed more proof, something undeniable. So, when David finally fell asleep, snoring softly beside me, I slipped out of bed and grabbed his phone from the nightstand. The act felt surreal, like I was breaking some sacred rule of trust, even though he had already obliterated ours. Unlocking the phone, I navigated back to his messages with Sophie. What I found wasn't just damning, it was grotesque. There were hundreds of texts, dating back months, filled with pet names, private jokes, and explicit exchanges that made my stomach churn. He called her baby, told her how much he missed her, and promised her the world. I scrolled further, my horror growing with every swipe. There were photos, selfies of Sophie in revealing outfits, bedroom shots taken in what looked like our guest bathroom. There were screenshots of online shopping orders, jewelry, clothes, even a plane ticket for her to visit him on a business trip he'd lied about taking last summer. Then came the kicker. The messages weren't confined to her being 18. The timestamp on one particular text exchange dated back to a few weeks before her 18th birthday. David, just a little longer, baby. After your birthday, we can stop pretending. Sophie, I know. It's just hard. I hate lying to Liam. I dropped the phone, my breath catching in my throat. They had been together before she was even legal. My husband, the man I trusted with everything, had been grooming my son's girlfriend. And she knew it was wrong, she knew. Yet they continued, conspiring to hide it from everyone, especially Liam. My mind spun as I pieced together memories that suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Sophie had started coming around more about a year ago, showing up even when Liam wasn't home, claiming she needed advice about school or family issues. David had always been a helpful dad, the type who prided himself on being approachable. It wasn't unusual for him to lend a hand to Liam's friends, offering advice or even a little cash when they were in a bind. Sophie had joked once, calling him her second dad. We'd all laughed. But now, looking back, her drop-ins seemed calculated. The way she lingered around David, the way he always had time for her, the way he praised her endlessly at family dinners, all of it painted a different picture. My heart sank as I realized how well he'd played all of us. David had used his role as a father figure to blur the lines, grooming her step by step until she saw him as something more. It was calculated, manipulative, and utterly monstrous. As I sat there, staring at the screen, a message popped up from Sophie. Sophie, can't sleep.
Thinking about you.
Wish I was in your bed. I felt an uncontrollable surge of rage. My mind screamed at me to wake David up, shove the phone in his face, and demand answers. But instead, I turned the phone off and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about me anymore. Liam deserved to know the truth, but I couldn't break his heart without being sure I had all the facts. I needed more than texts, I needed the full picture. I spent the next 2 hours combing through every corner of David's phone. His emails revealed receipts for hotel stays during work trips that lined up suspiciously with Sophie's weekends off from her part-time job. A folder hidden in his photo gallery held more pictures of Sophie, some innocent, but many that weren't. And then there were the lies. I found drafts of messages David had written to excuse his absences. Late meeting tonight, don't wait up. Heading out of town for a few days. Work emergency. Helping Sophie with a school project. She asked me to keep it between us. Each excuse, written so casually, had been carefully tailored to avoid suspicion. And I'd believed him every single time. By the time the sun began to rise, I had collected everything I could. I forwarded incriminating emails and screenshots to myself and stashed his phone back, where I'd found it. But the weight of what I'd uncovered was crushing. David wasn't just a cheater. He was a predator, someone who had manipulated and preyed on a vulnerable young woman under the guise of being a cool dad. And Sophie, though complicit, was just as much a victim of his twisted games. The worst part? I still didn't know how to face him, or how to protect Liam from the devastation that was about to follow. As I sat on the edge of my bed, watching David sleep, I felt a sickening mix of rage and heartbreak. This man, the father of my children, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, had become a stranger, a monster in disguise. And the fallout was only just beginning. I knew the confrontation with Liam was inevitable, but I hadn't worked out how to break the news. He was in love with Sophie, his first serious girlfriend, the one he'd introduced to the family with a shy, proud smile. For months, he'd gushed about her, how she understood him better than anyone else, how he could talk to her about anything. To him, Sophie wasn't just a girlfriend. She was a safe place. How could I shatter that? How could I take away his first love with the truth about what she'd done, and worse, who she'd done it with? For days, I avoided him as much as I could without raising suspicion. But the weight of the secret pressed harder on me every time we sat at the dinner table together, every time he casually mentioned Sophie, oblivious to the truth. It felt like I was watching a train barrel toward him, powerless to pull him off the tracks. I didn't have to decide how to tell him. The decision was made for me one evening when Liam came into the living room, pale and shaking, holding his phone like it was a live grenade. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "can you explain this?" He handed me the phone, and I saw a series of screenshots he had taken of Sophie's texts. It didn't take long to figure out what had happened. She'd been careless, texting both David and Liam at the same time. One of her messages meant for David had landed in Liam's inbox instead. "Miss you already. I can't stop thinking about your hands on me last night. Hugs and kisses." My heart broke as I looked at him. His eyes were full of pain and confusion, as if he were begging me to tell him it wasn't true. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is this real? Is she? Are they?" I wanted to lie to him, to protect him from the ugly truth for just a little longer. But I couldn't. He deserved honesty, no matter how much it would hurt. I nodded slowly, tears streaming down my face. "Liam, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you." He stared at me, his face crumpling as the reality set in. "Dad," he choked out. "Sophie? My dad." He collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands as sobs racked his body. I sat next to him, wrapping my arms around him, even though I knew nothing I could say or do would make this better. "I'm sorry," I kept saying, over and over again. "I'm so sorry." The sound of Liam's cries brought Ella downstairs. She was only 14, but she was sharp and quick to pick up on tension. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice edged with worry. Liam didn't look up, so I met Ella's questioning gaze. How could I explain this to her without destroying her trust in the family, too? "Ella, there's something really hard I need to tell you," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. She crossed her arms, looking from me to Liam and back again. "Is it about Dad? What did he do?" I flinched at her intuition. "Ella, your dad has been seeing someone he shouldn't be. He's been involved with Sophie." The color drained from her face. "Liam, Sophie?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, and her face twisted in a mixture of shock, disgust, and anger. "That's disgusting," she spat. "How could he? How could she?" Her voice broke off, and she turned and ran upstairs, slamming her door behind her. I sat there with Liam, his sobs gradually quieting, the weight of what had just happened crushing me. In the span of an hour, the family I'd spent 20 years building was crumbling before my eyes. The next day, the silence in the house was unbearable. Liam barely spoke to anyone, staying locked in his room. Ella refused to come down for breakfast and only communicated through curt text messages. I didn't even bother trying to talk to David. He'd left early for work, oblivious to the emotional carnage he'd caused. By the time he came home that evening, the storm was ready to break. Liam stormed out of his room as soon as he heard the front door open. "You disgust me," Liam shouted, his voice shaking with fury. David froze, his keys still in his hand. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Sophie," Liam yelled. "I know about Sophie. You've been screwing my girlfriend, Dad." The words hung in the air like a bomb detonating. David's face went pale, but he quickly masked it with a feigned look of confusion. "Liam, I think you're misunderstanding something." "Don't!" Liam roared. "Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the messages. I know what you've been doing behind my back, you sick bastard." David glanced at me, and I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He must have realized I'd found out and hadn't kept it to myself. "Liam," he started again, his voice calmer. "This isn't what you think." "Shut up," Liam interrupted, his voice cracking. "You're pathetic. You've ruined everything." He turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. After Liam left, David and I stood in silence for a moment before the floodgates opened. I let out everything I'd been holding back. The texts, the photos, the receipts, all the lies he'd told me and the kids. He didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he acted indignant, as if he were the victim. "You don't understand, Claire," he said. "Sophie and I, we have a connection. She makes me feel alive in a way you haven't in years. His words were like a slap to the face. She's a child, I hissed. She's our son's girlfriend. You've destroyed our family for what? Your disgusting midlife crisis. David's expression hardened. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. I couldn't believe the audacity of his response. Without another word, I walked upstairs to check on Ella, leaving him standing in the living room, a stranger in my home. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized there was no coming back from this. David had torn our family apart, and the damage was irreparable. The only question now was how much more we could survive before everything shattered completely. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The chaos had reached a boiling point, and I needed answers, not just for myself, but for my kids. When David came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room. The moment he stepped inside, I closed the door behind him with a loud click, ensuring no one would interrupt what was about to happen. "We need to talk," I said, my voice ice cold. David set his keys down on the entryway table and turned to face me, an unreadable expression on his face. "All right," he said, shrugging. "What's this about?" I held up my phone, showing him the screenshots I'd taken of his messages with Sophie. "Don't play dumb, David. I know everything." For a second, his face faltered. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes before he quickly regained composure. But instead of denying it, instead of trying to explain or apologize, he smirked. "Well, I guess it's out now," he said casually, as though I'd just discovered he'd forgotten to take out the trash. I stared at him, stunned by his lack of remorse. "That's all you have to say? I've spent the last 20 years building a life with you, raising a family, trusting you, and you throw it all away for her? She's our son's girlfriend, David. Do you even realize how disgusting this is?" He crossed his arms and leaned back slightly, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Sophie and I have something real. Something meaningful. You and I haven't had that in years." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Meaningfuls?" I repeated, my voice rising. "She's barely out of high school. You're old enough to be her father." "She's legal now," he said, waving me off like I was overreacting. "And age doesn't matter when it's real. She makes me feel alive, Claire. Something you stopped doing a long time ago." The audacity of his words left me momentarily speechless. I stared at him, trying to process how the man I thought I knew could be this heartless, this selfish. "You're disgusting," I finally spat. "You've not only betrayed me, you've betrayed Liam. Do you even care about what this has done to him?" To Ella. David rolled his eyes. "Liam will get over it. He's young. He doesn't understand how complicated relationships can be. He'll move on." "Move on," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You've destroyed him, David. You've destroyed our family, and all you can do is stand here and defend your disgusting behaviors." At that moment, Liam came storming into the room, his face red with anger. "Are you seriously trying to justify this?" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. "You're pathetic, Dad." David turned to him, his smirk gone, replaced by a stern glare. "Watch your tone, Liam. You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I don't." Liam shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I don't know what it's like to find out my own father is screwing my girlfriend. I don't know what it's like to have my first love ripped away by someone I'm supposed to look up to. You're a joke, Dad. A selfish, pathetic joke." David's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to Liam. "You're acting immature," he said, his voice low and sharp. "This isn't about you, Liam. You're just jealous because Sophie and I have something you never could." Liam's face twisted with rage. "Jealous?" he shouted. "You think I'm jealous? You ruined everything. You ruined my relationship, my family. You ruined us." The room was a pressure cooker about to explode. Before I could step in, Liam let out a guttural scream and punched the wall beside him, leaving a jagged hole in the drywall. David flinched slightly, but quickly recovered, shaking his head in disgust. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his tone condescending. "You're too emotional, too immature to understand." "Get out," Liam growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Excuse me?" David said, raising an eyebrow. "I said get out," Liam screamed, pointing toward the door. I stepped between them, my hands shaking as I pushed David back. "You've done enough damage for one night," I said, my voice trembling. "Leave, David. Just leave." David stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, He grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Liam sank onto the couch, his shoulders shaking as tears spilled down his face. I sat next to him, wrapping my arms around him, while Ella appeared in the doorway, her face pale and frightened. "What's going to happen now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was hold my children and pray that somehow we would survive the wreckage David had left behind. After David left that night, the house was eerily quiet. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, like the aftermath of a storm that had only begun to show its damage. Liam shut himself in his room, refusing to speak to anyone, and Ella avoided eye contact every time we crossed paths. My children were broken, and I felt powerless to fix them. But beneath my heartbreak and exhaustion, something else began to stir. Anger. Not just at David, but at myself. How had I missed this? How had I not seen the cracks forming, the lies unraveling right under my nose? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed answers, not just for closure, but to protect my kids from whatever horrors David might have been hiding. So, the morning after the confrontation, I started digging. David's email was my first target. His password hadn't changed in years, and I logged in without issue. What I found there sent a chill down my spine. There were countless emails from burner accounts, each with vague subject lines like "catch up" or "last night." One email thread stood out, labeled only with a date. I opened it and saw a back-and-forth conversation between David and Sophie's best friend, Madison. "David, thanks for helping keep Sophie calm. She's been anxious about her parents finding out." "Madison, no problem, but you owe me. This whole thing is crazy." "David, don't worry. I'll take care of you too." My blood ran cold. Madison had known about the affair and had even helped cover it up. Worse, David's tone suggested there was more to their relationship than just casual correspondence. I kept scrolling, finding receipts for gifts I hadn't noticed before, an expensive bracelet, a designer purse, even plane tickets for Sophie. David had been using a separate bank account to fund these purchases. I traced the account to a new email address, one I didn't recognize. Breaking into the second email was harder, but with enough trial and error, I managed it. The inbox was full of filth. There were chats with other young women, most of them barely out of high school. Some of the conversations were innocent enough at first, but they quickly escalated into inappropriate territory. "David, you're so mature for your age. I bet all the guys at school are intimidated by you." Anonymous girl. LOL, not really. "Why would you say that?" "David, because you're stunning. Any guy would be lucky to have you." Winking face. The chat logs made me feel sick. David wasn't just a man who had made a terrible mistake. He was a predator. Sophie wasn't the first, and judging by the frequency of these messages, she wouldn't be the last. My stomach churned as I stumbled upon hidden folders in his cloud storage. Inside were pictures, dozens of them. Some were selfies of Sophie, some were screenshots of their messages, and others were from women I didn't recognize. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just an affair. It was a pattern of manipulation, a web of lies David had spun around himself to hide his predatory behavior. The final piece of the puzzle came when I hacked into his work computer. I wasn't proud of it, but desperation pushed me beyond moral boundaries. On his desktop, I found more hidden folders, each labeled with cryptic names: vacation, memories, projects. Opening the vacation folder made my skin crawl. It contained photos of David with Sophie, at a hotel, in a restaurant, even at a park I recognized as being just outside her college campus. These weren't just snapshots. They were moments he had meticulously documented, moments he should have shared with his family, but instead gave to a girl half his age. The memories folder was worse. Inside were screenshots of conversations with other women. Some of them were no older than 16, their naivety painfully obvious in the messages. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture became. David had been living a double life for years, using his charm and authority to prey on vulnerable young women. And Sophie? She was just the latest in a long line of victims. I couldn't stop picturing the way he'd smiled at me over the years, the way he'd held our children, all while harboring this monstrous secret. By the time I closed his laptop, I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even just about Sophie. David was dangerous, and I couldn't let him keep hurting people. But the question lingered. What could I do? How could I protect my children, expose his behavior, and ensure no one else fell victim to his lies? For the first time in days, I felt something beyond grief and rage. I felt purpose. I was going to stop him, whatever it took. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when I heard the timid knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it might be David coming to grovel. But when I opened the door, I found Sophie standing there, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked like a child who'd just been scolded, a far cry from the confident girl who had charmed her way into my family's life. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face. This was the girl who had destroyed my family, who had betrayed my son, and laughed alongside my husband at my expense. But another part of me, the mother in me, saw a scared and broken young woman standing on my porch. Against my better judgment, I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once shared meals with us, as if she were part of the family. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, twisting her hands nervously. "I don't even know where to start," she said finally. "Try the truth," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. Her lip quivered, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "It started when I was 16, she said quietly. "David, your husband, he started messaging me on social media. At first, it was innocent. He said he wanted to help me with school, with my future. He made me feel special, like I mattered." I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. "And you didn't think that was inappropriate?" "I didn't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I mean, I thought it was weird at first, but he was so kind, so supportive. He said I could trust him. He said he saw potential in me, that he wanted to mentor me." I could feel the rage boiling under my skin. David hadn't just taken advantage of her. He had manipulated her, groomed her, and twisted her perception of right and wrong. When did it become more than that? I asked, my voice trembling. Sophie hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "A few months later," she said. "He started complimenting me, saying things that no one else ever had. He said I was beautiful, that I was mature for my age. He made me feel like I was special, like I was the only one who understood him." Her words were like a knife twisting in my gut. I thought of all the times David had praised her in front of us, the way he joked about her being like one of the family. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide what he was really doing. "I didn't know how to stop it," Sophie continued, her voice breaking. I thought he loved me." Her admission hit me harder than I expected. For all her complicity, she was still a victim, a young girl who had been manipulated by someone she should have been able to trust. "And what about Liam?" I asked, my voice icy. "Did you think about him at all while you were sneaking around with his fathers?" She flinched, her shoulders shaking as fresh tears fell. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she sobbed. "I didn't know how to end it. David said he'd handle it, that he'd make things right. But he never did." I stood up, unable to sit any longer. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I said, my voice rising. "You didn't just betray Liam. You betrayed this entire family. You laughed in my face while you were sneaking around with my husband. And now you expect me to what? Feel sorry for you?" Sophie buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know what to do." Her apology felt hollow, a drop of water in a sea of damage. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her to leave and never come back. But the truth was, nothing I said to her would fix what had been broken. "You need to go," I said finally, my voice cold and firm. Sophie looked up at me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Please," she whispered. "I just want to make it right." "You can't," I interrupted. "You've done enough. Just leave, Sophie." She hesitated for a moment, as if hoping I might change my mind. But when I didn't move, she stood and shuffled toward the door. Before she left, she turned back to me, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she said again. I didn't respond. I stood in the doorway, watching as she walked away, her shoulders hunched against the cold. When I closed the door, I leaned against it, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. Sophie's confession hadn't given me closure. If anything, it had only deepened the wound. David had taken everything good and pure in our lives and twisted it into something ugly and unrecognizable. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces that felt sharper and heavier with every passing day. The decision to take legal action against David wasn't an easy one. As much as I wanted to sever every tie to him, I knew it wouldn't be simple. He wasn't just my husband. He was the father of my children, and his actions had left deep scars on our family. But I couldn't sit by and let him walk away unscathed. He had manipulated, betrayed, and preyed on a young woman, and I was determined to hold him accountable for every part of it. Thankfully, my brother, Matt, was a lawyer with years of experience in family law. When I called him and explained everything, he didn't waste a second. He drove over the same day, and we spent hours combing through the evidence I'd gathered. Texts, emails, screenshots, receipts. "This is strong," Matt said, flipping through the stack of printed messages. "But it's going to be a fight. Men like David don't go down without a fight." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm ready," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We started with the restraining order. I couldn't bear the thought of David coming back to the house, trying to manipulate the kids or me. Matt helped me file it quickly, and within a week, it was granted. David was legally required to stay away from the house, from me, and from Liam and Ella. But that was just the beginning. The divorce proceedings were where things got truly ugly. David hired a high-powered attorney who wasted no time attacking me. He denied everything, claiming that the evidence I'd gathered was fabricated. He said the texts were doctored, the photos staged, and the receipts irrelevant. His lawyer painted me as a bitter, vindictive wife who was trying to ruin his life out of spite. And David didn't stop there. He accused me of neglecting him, of failing to meet his needs as a wife. In one particularly cruel moment during mediation, he had the audacity to suggest that I had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. And now you're trying to blame me for it." David leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. "I'm just stating the facts, Claire. You checked out of this marriage long before I did." Matt placed a calming hand on my arm, silently reminding me not to rise to the bait. But inside, I was boiling. David wasn't just trying to save face. He was rewriting history, erasing his own predatory behavior and replacing it with lies designed to make me look like the villain. The worst part was Sophie. Despite her tearful confession at my kitchen table, she refused to cooperate when it came to the legal battle. She wouldn't testify against David, wouldn't confirm the timeline of their relationship, and wouldn't hand over her own messages as evidence. I knew she was scared. David had manipulated her so thoroughly that she still believed he cared about her. But her refusal to come forward made everything harder. Without her testimony, much of the evidence I had collected was circumstantial. Without Sophie on the stand, it's going to be tough to prove the predatory angle, Matt explained. We can still push for the divorce and full custody, but holding him accountable for anything beyond that is an uphill battle. I felt a wave of frustration and despair. How could David keep getting away with this? How could he twist the truth so easily, leaving me to fight against his lies with one hand tied behind my back? The court battles dragged on for months, each hearing more draining than the last. Every time I thought we were making progress, David's team found a way to stall or deflect. He tried to paint himself as a devoted father, claiming he deserved joint custody despite the damage he'd done to our children. Liam refused to attend the hearings, but his anger toward David hadn't diminished. He told me once, late at night, if the court lets him back into our lives, I'm leaving. I won't stay in the same house as him. Ella, on the other hand, was quieter about her feelings. She'd become withdrawn since the fallout, her once bright personality dimmed by the weight of it all. I knew she was struggling, but I didn't know how to help her. Through it all, Matt remained a steady presence, guiding me through the legal maze with patience and determination. But even he couldn't hide his frustration at the system's limitations. "Men like David are good at playing the victim," he said one evening after a particularly grueling hearing. "It's infuriating, but we'll keep fighting. We'll make sure the truth comes out." By the time the restraining order was extended and the preliminary custody agreement was settled, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. David had fought tooth and nail to maintain control, and though we'd made some progress, it felt like a hollow victory. He was still out there, free to manipulate and hurt others. And without Sophie's cooperation, there was little I could do to stop him. As I sat in the quiet of my new apartment one night, staring at the stack of legal documents on the coffee table, I felt a gnawing sense of helplessness. The fight wasn't over, but I was beginning to wonder if it ever truly would be. All I knew was that I couldn't let David win. Not for me, not for Liam, not for Ella. He might have shattered our family, but I refused to let him break us completely. The fallout hit Liam and Ella in ways I hadn't anticipated, though in hindsight, I should have. David's actions hadn't just destroyed our marriage, they'd fractured the very foundation of our family, leaving cracks that widened every day. Liam, once so full of ambition and life, began to crumble before my eyes. He stopped attending his classes, missed assignment deadlines, and ignored calls from his professors. His decision to drop out of college came with little fanfare, no dramatic announcement, no discussion. One day, he simply stopped going. I don't see the point anymore, he muttered when I tried to talk to him about it. I can't focus. I don't even know who I am right now. It wasn't just his education that suffered. Liam withdrew from his friends, ignoring messages and turning down invitations. He spent most of his days in his room, curtains drawn, barely speaking to anyone. His guitar, once a constant presence in our home, sat untouched in the corner, gathering dust. The few times I managed to coax him into a conversation, he was riddled with guilt. "How could I not see it, Mom?" he said one evening, his voice breaking. "She was my girlfriend. How could I not realize she was with him?" "Liam, this isn't your fault," I said, reaching for his hand. But he pulled away, shaking his head. "I brought her into our family," he said bitterly. "I trusted her. And Dad, he used me to get to her." Ella, on the other hand, was quieter in her pain, but no less broken. At just 14, she was still trying to make sense of the world, and David's betrayal had shaken her understanding of what family was supposed to mean. She spent hours locked in her room, only emerging for meals or school. Her once bright personality, the spark that made her the heart of our family, dimmed to a dull flicker. She stopped drawing, stopped texting her friends, stopped doing anything that brought her joy. When I tried to talk to her, she would shrug or give one-word answers, her walls impenetrable. The few times she opened up, it was clear she was grappling with anger and confusion. "How could Dad do this?" she asked me once, her voice trembling. "How could he throw us away like that? Doesn't he care about us?" I wanted to reassure her, to give her answers that made sense. But the truth was, I didn't know how to explain David's actions to her. I didn't understand them myself. I tried to hold it together for them, but most days, I felt like I was drowning. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, though they were far from a quick fix. Liam's therapist worked tirelessly to help him process his guilt and anger, but progress was slow. He had built walls around himself, and tearing them down was going to take time. Ella's sessions were even more challenging. She refused to talk at first, sitting in sullen silence with her arms crossed. Her therapist assured me that this was normal, that it was part of the process, but it was hard to see her retreat further into herself. Meanwhile, I was barely holding it together in my own sessions. Talking about David, about what he'd done, felt like picking at a wound that refused to heal. My therapist kept reminding me to take things one day at a time, but the weight of holding my family together was suffocating. Everywhere I turned, I saw the wreckage of David's actions. The house felt emptier, without Liam's music or Ella's laughter. Family dinners were silent affairs, the air heavy with unspoken pain. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I found a crumpled piece of paper in the trash. It was one of Ella's old drawings, a colorful sketch of our family at the beach. She'd drawn us all smiling, the sun shining down on us, her younger self standing proudly between David and me. I stared at the drawing for a long time, my chest tightening with grief. That version of us was gone, replaced by something fractured and raw. The worst part was knowing that no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shield Liam and Ella from the pain. David's betrayal had left scars that therapy alone couldn't heal. It had shattered their trust, not just in him, but in the concept of family itself. One night, as I sat on the edge of Liam's bed, watching him stare blankly at the wall, I whispered, "We'll get through this. I don't know how yet, but we will." He didn't respond, but for the first time in weeks, he reached for my hand and squeezed it. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in that moment, I realized that even in the midst of all this pain, I had to keep fighting for Liam, for Ella, and for the fragile threads of our family that still remained. Months had passed since David walked out of our lives, but the pain he left behind lingered like a shadow. The divorce proceedings were grinding on, and while the restraining order kept him away from the house, it didn't stop him from hovering on the edges of my thoughts. Every time my phone buzzed unexpectedly, I braced myself, half expecting a call from him or his lawyer. But one evening, the notification was something entirely different. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through bills, when a new email appeared in my inbox. The subject line was vague. "You need to see this?" The sender's address was anonymous, a jumble of letters and numbers that gave no clue as to their identity. My finger hovered over the email for a moment. Part of me wanted to delete it and move on. But curiosity, or maybe dread, got the better of me. I opened it. Inside were screenshots. The images were of a conversation between David and a girl I didn't recognize. She looked painfully young, her profile picture showing a fresh-faced teen with braces and a wide smile. The messages started innocently enough, compliments about her appearance, jokes about her hobbies. But as the screenshots progressed, David's tone shifted. "David, you're so mature for your age. It's refreshing to talk to someone who gets me. Girl, lol, thanks, I guess. David, I bet all the guys at school are jealous of you. You're stunning." The timestamp on the messages was recent, just a few weeks old. The girl's age? 17. My stomach churned as I read further, each message more manipulative than the last. David was using the same tactics he'd used on Sophie, flattery disguised as mentorship, subtle suggestions that she was special, that only he truly appreciated her. The email ended with a warning from the sender. "He hasn't stopped. You need to do something before it's too late." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. After everything that had happened, I'd clung to the hope that David's actions were a one-time betrayal, a catastrophic mistake born out of midlife crisis and selfishness. But this email shattered that illusion. David wasn't just a cheater. He was a predator, and he wasn't going to stop. I forwarded the email to Matt immediately, attaching the screenshots with a brief note. "We need to act on this now." His response came within minutes. "This is serious. I'll contact the authorities." The next morning, we met with the detective assigned to David's case. I handed over everything, the email, the screenshots, the timeline of his behavior. The detective listened carefully, nodding as I explained David's history with Sophie and the new messages I'd received. "This fits the pattern of grooming," she said, flipping through the evidence. "But without cooperation from the victim, it's hard to move forward with charges. Do you know who this girl is?" I shook my head, frustration bubbling up inside me. "No." The email was anonymous. "But someone knows. Someone is trying to warn me." The detective promised to investigate, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. Without testimony from the girl, or from Sophie, it would be difficult to build a strong case. When I called Sophie to tell her about the new messages, hoping she might finally be willing to come forward, her response was disheartening. I can't," she said, her voice shaky. "I just want to forget it ever happened. Please don't ask me to relive it." "Sophie," I said gently, "this isn't just about you anymore. He's doing it again. To someone else. She's only 17. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I'm sorry, Claire. I really am. But I can't." I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. Without Sophie's cooperation or the new girl stepping forward, David's pattern of behavior remained in the shadows, unchallenged. The weeks that followed were filled with dead ends. The authorities traced the anonymous email to a burner account, but they couldn't identify the sender or the girl in the screenshots. David's lawyer denied everything, claiming the messages were fabricated and accusing me of orchestrating a smear campaign. It felt like I was running in circles, hitting wall after wall. Meanwhile, David was out there, free to manipulate and hurt someone else. One night, as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the stack of legal documents and police reports on my nightstand, I felt an overwhelming sense of failure. I had tried so hard to protect my kids, to shield them from David's actions, to bring him to justice. But it wasn't enough. I thought about the girl in the screenshots, about how scared and confused she must feel. I thought about Sophie, still trapped in her own pain and unable to move forward. And I thought about Liam and Ella, their trust in the world forever shaken by the man who was supposed to be their protector. David might have left our lives, but the damage he caused was far from over. And the thought of him continuing his predatory behavior, unchecked and unpunished, kept me awake at night. I didn't know what the next step would be, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stop fighting. Not while David was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. Life after David has been a slow, painful process of reconstruction. I moved us into a smaller house about 3 months after the restraining order was finalized. The decision wasn't just financial, it was emotional. I couldn't stay in the place where every corner held a memory of the life we used to have. The new house is smaller, simpler, and quieter. But it's ours. The kids have been trying to adjust in their own ways. Liam has been attending therapy regularly, though it's been a long road for him. Some days, I see glimpses of the vibrant young man he used to be, The Liam who would fill the house with music, whose laugh was contagious. Other days, he's distant, his sadness etched into every line of his face. Ella is slowly finding her footing again. She started hanging out with her friends more, even picking up her sketchbook after months of leaving it untouched. But the spark that used to light up her eyes hasn't fully returned, and I don't know if it ever will. As for me, I'm doing what I can to keep us all moving forward. David, though physically absent, remains a ghost in our lives. His presence lingers in ways I can't fully explain. I've cut off all communication with him, but every now and then, I hear whispers, rumors from mutual acquaintances, or scraps of information from people who don't realize I don't want to hear his name. The latest rumor is that he's still with Sophie. Part of me wants to scream at her, to shake her, and make her see the truth about the man she's with. But another part of me knows it's not that simple. She's young, confused, and likely still under his manipulative spell. I can only hope she escapes him one day, though I'm not sure what she'll look like on the other side of it. Rebuilding my own life has been harder than I thought. Some days, I wake up feeling strong, determined to carve out a new path for myself and my kids. On those days, I throw myself into work, into cooking meals for the kids, into small home projects that make this new house feel like home. But other days, the weight of everything crushes me. The betrayal, the pain, the endless legal battles, the strain of trying to hold my family together, it all feels too much. On those days, I sit in the quiet of my bedroom, staring out the window and wondering how we got here. I've started therapy too, though it's a slow process. My therapist tells me that healing isn't linear, that it's okay to have bad days, but sometimes it feels like the bad days outnumber the good. The hardest part is the uncertainty of the future. I used to have a vision of what my life would look like, a life with David, watching our kids grow, growing old together. That vision is gone, replaced by something murky and undefined. I don't know what's ahead for me, but I know I have to keep moving forward. Not just for Liam and Ella, but for myself. I can't let David's actions define the rest of my life. Somewhere deep down, I feel a flicker of hope. It's small and fragile, but it's there. Hope that one day, the scars won't hurt so much. Hope that my kids will find their way. Hope that I can rebuild a life that feels whole again. Until then, I'll keep fighting. For my kids, for myself, for the life we deserve, even if it means walking this road alone.